Good morning, Stephen.
Well, hello there.
And Falcor apparently
Falcor.
this morning.
He's decided not to just lie down in my lap today. He wants to be in the picture. He wants to run things. Actually, he's staring out the window checking for squirrels.
All right. And so are you going to be able to share tips with us?
If not, I'll ask Falcor to do it. It shouldn't be a problem.
Sorry, I had something going on over here on the screen. I suddenly got distracted. So, well, hopefully you'll still be able to reach the keyboard and share some great tips with us this week.
I've got 2 keyboards I can reach here. No problem. 2 keyboards,
Right.
2 monitors, lots of paintings. We're good. Got my book all picked out. So, yes. So what we're going to do is spend some time talking about a tip I've got, which some of you might like, some of you might actually not like. And then we'll take a look at the organizations that we're going to donate to. And one of you will be chosen to pick the donation. And then I'll show you my book of the week. Shall we dive right in?
Let's dive right in.
Okay, so my topic for this week is on the cheap testing. So as some of you may know, back in 1999, I published UT-PL-SQL version 1, unit testing for PL-SQL. It essentially was JUnit for PL-SQL. And it was, I believe, the first testing framework for the PL-SQL users. And I used it a little bit, not as much as I should have. And it's been used over the years, stayed alive. And then I think about 5 years ago, took a dramatic reinvigoration with a whole new team coming out with version 3. Really cool stuff. In addition, in terms of my history with unit testing, I also helped design and build a tool called Quest Code Tester for Oracle, which is part of the Toad Suite for development, still owned by Quest. So I've got a fair amount of experience around building comprehensive automated regression testing frameworks. What I don't have is a whole lot of experience in using them because I, like most developers, kind of lazy, kind of like, do I have time to do that? Kind of like, even if I build it, will I stick with it? So I never became a big user of my own tools. And clearly, while there's a strong UT-PL-SQL community, and I think still growing, and there are people using these other tools, including SQL Developer Unit Testing, which is integrated into the tool. There are a number of options available. I've got to figure 90% of our community do not use them. And I thought I'd offer you some ideas around not making you feel bad about not using UT-PL-SQL, since obviously I don't even use it myself, but to talk about, well, if you're not going to go the full route of installing a framework and using it, what could you do that maybe is a little bit closer to that, that's practical to achieve? So that's what I want to talk about today is on the cheap testing, getting some of the benefits of using a framework without having to install, learn how to use, and build code based on the framework.
So you started out by saying you think some people might like what you have to say, other people might not. Are you dividing that based on those that are already using UT-PL-SQL and those that are?
Well, yeah, I don't want anybody to feel like I'm discouraging folks from trying these real comprehensive frameworks and powerful utilities. You should check them out. It's just that, look, we have to deal with reality. And the reality is that most of us are not going to take the time to learn it and use it. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, what that means is that we're left with what we call testing. So let's face it, for the most part, when we say we're testing our program or we tested our program, what it means is that we tried a few things that seem like the most obvious things that anybody would do with the program, and it worked, or we got it to work finally. And then we're like, good, we're done. And there are so many problems with that process. First of all, trying a few things is not the same as testing. Also, when you, the developer of the program, decide these are the few things I'm going to try because I think these are the way that users are going to use them, 2 problems. 1, psychologically, even though you don't know it, you're going to pick scenarios that are most likely to work because that's where you spent the time. Right. Number 2, I've got to believe that if you've been around software for 5 years or 2 years or whatever length of time, you surely have learned that the way we, the writers of the program and the application, think users are going to use the app is not how people use the app, right? I remember a long time ago when I left Oracle the first time and I joined a consulting company, and my first engagement was at McDonald's Corporation. And I was building an Oracle Forms app back then. I think it was actually still SQL Forms 3. Is that possible? Maybe so.
Don't give away your age, Stephen.
Excuse me?
Don't give away your age.
I give away my age all the time. I'm 62 and a half. So I was working with it. I had a single person user. And I was building an app for specific functionality. I built it, looked really good. I tried it out, tested it. I sit down with the user for her to try it, and the first thing she does breaks it wide open, because I didn't think, like, well, nobody's ever going to do that. So there are lots of flaws with the way we go about trying our code to make sure it works. And so I thought I'd offer some ideas around, making it better. Why don't you go ahead and share my screen? So I've got a blog post. So we're going to publish a blog post before the end of the day on my Feuertips site on InSum, specifically on this topic. And it references this blog post, which is checklist-driven development. And I just thought I'd use this as a framework for some of our conversation today. So I think the first thing that you should do is ask yourself a really simple question before you start writing any code. Oh, did I go past it? Come back. The first question you should ask about your program before you start writing is, how will I know when I'm done? Now, what seems like obvious at some point, right? You're writing code and then you stop writing code and then you deploy it and like, I'm done. The thing is, we actually usually don't know when we're done because we haven't thought about what defines being done. So I suggest that the first thing you do before starting to write any code is ask yourself, what is this program supposed to do to prove that it works? Even if you don't get, essentially they're test scenarios. Even if you don't get to implement all of them or test all of them, you'll have set in your mind a psychological bar to reach. These are the things the program has to do, and you can, in fact, kind of check them off as you go. So I call it checklist-driven development because there's been a big move towards, whoops, scrolling on the wrong page. Here's an example of a little checklist document. It's still hard to read. That's okay. Reading is not critical there. Whoa, where'd you go? There we go. So the idea is that you literally list out the different things that the program should be able to do, which you can then come back later and use as a checklist to say, does it do it, right? So the point about checklists is that they can make an enormous difference in a very fundamental, simple way. I'm sure you've all heard the story about surgery and checklists. So pilots, airline pilots have long worked off of it's probably not a piece of paper anymore, it's probably in their tablet now, but they would literally have a piece of paper that was a checklist. Let's see, do we have 2 wings? Check. Do we have electricity? Check. Obviously a better checklist than that. They would go through the checklist before they took off. They couldn't afford to make mistakes. Well, surgeons, you'd think, couldn't afford to make mistakes, but here, you can stop sharing for a moment. But surgeries have lots of mistakes in them. For example, oh, I just removed the wrong leg. Oh, this isn't Sally, it's Joe. Literally, this would happen. Probably still happens, but about 15 years ago, a surgeon in Boston, I think, said, you know what? I think I'm going to make a simple checklist. Check the name tag. Check which limb you're supposed to remove. Like literally questions like that.
Keeping it super, super basic, right? And not saying, well, I'm not even going to put that down. Of course, I'll check that. Just anything
exactly
as base. Okay.
And it reduced surgical mistakes by something like 93%. It was insane. So the same thing for us. How do I know my program is done? Let's come up with a list. So that's the first step for on-the-cheap testing. You can put it into a document. You can build a little app with a table and store your different things. The main thing is the thought process. Ask yourself, how will I know when I'm done? Okay. The next step, I go into this a bit in my blog post that you'll see later today. I'm not going to go into great detail here, is then use assertions. So there are a number of aspects of testing. One of them is making sure that the inputs are correct, that the assumptions you make about your program are correct. Every time we write a program, we make assumptions. Often those assumptions are not validated, and they cause problems down the line in your code. So the idea behind assertions is at the very top of your program, you assert that certain things are true. For example, the department ID cannot be null. Well, then right at the top of your block of code, say, if department ID is null, then raise an error, right? Don't even try to continue. So moving on from how do I know I'm done to using assertions to proactively flag issues before you get to the body of code. Now I want to go on to building an on-the-cheap test harness. And now please share my screen and let's look at SQL Developer. So this came up a couple of weeks when I was working on some code. And let's first of all show you the code. So it was actually an interesting process in a number of ways because I was working in an environment in which the data model, big surprise, was not optimal. The way that we were compensating for the bad data model was not optimal, but hey, it's reality. So here's the situation. We've got a customer who is, and by the way, all of this is changed. It's not the actual customer, the actual content. And now there we go, SQL developer is not frozen. So basically, let's say it's the Environmental Protection Agency, and they do investigations. And they keep track of, for an investigation, what kind of spray, when did a spraying occur? They were spraying events, and what kind of pesticides. And the thing about it is that a spray could have multiple pesticides. You could do a pesticide without a spray, I guess. So we had this table of investigation details with an investigation ID, spray, and pesticide. And here's the thing, we had to write a program to pack the data into the rows, by which I say that if there was a row with an investigation ID and a spray ID, but no pesticide ID, then when we want to log the pesticide ID, we'd add it to the row to fill it out. But if the pesticide ID was not null, if both of these were not null, and I wanted to add another detail for a new pesticide, it would create a new row. Pretty weird stuff, right? But that's the way real applications are. They're all kind of weird, unless you get super lucky. So we wrote a piece of code to do this. I'm not going to go into all the details. It'll be published on the blog. You can look at it and give us feedback. But it went on for quite a bit. I think it's extremely readable. I even put in some comments. But again, the point of this exercise right now is not to go through the details of it. But I bet that some of you will look at this and come up with better ways to do it. Anyway, non-trivial program. The question is, how do you go about testing it? Now, one way to test it, and one of the ways the developer who was originally working on this app was testing, is they had an Apex app. So they'd run the code to execute this. And then in the app, they'd look at the data and see if it looked right. Or they actually go to SQL Developer, run a query against the row and see if the right things were null or not null, which is a good thing to do as you're building the program, just to get a basic gut sense, am I even close? But at some point, with those simple tries, you're done. Now you really want to get a little bit more comprehensive. And how do you do that? So here's what I did. I built a little on-the-cheap test harness. Now, the nice thing about building your own test harness is that you can make it bespoke to the specific procedure. Every test harness can be different. There's a downside to that in that you have to build each one, but you'll do a lot of copy pasting over time. There's a plus side, which is that you can make it very specific. So here's what I did. I've got a procedure called check results. And I basically say, well, let's go out to the investigation details table for a given investigation ID, and I check to see whether or not if the pesticide value is null, the spray ID is null, but then I look to see if I expect it to be null or not null, expect it to be null or not null. So this single query allows me to check for different data conditions. Here's how I use it. So I clear out my array of rows. So as you probably know, part of the big challenges with doing database procedure testing is that it's not standalone code. It's connected to a database. So the database state is critical to reproducible testing. One of the biggest challenges for us. So this is my reproducibility. I just take everything out of the table. Oops. Now, obviously, that's not always possible. In fact, in reality, it wouldn't even be possible here, but we'll just assume it. I do some kind of reset. And then I pack my details. So here's the program, and I say, pass in an investigation ID, pass in both pesticide and spray. Now, this means there should be one row in the table in which both those columns are not null. Okay, check the results. There's the name of my test. There's the investigation ID. There should be one row, and none of them should be null. You see, so I can define the test case. This turns it into a validation step. And then in this case, interestingly enough, I can actually build on top of my previous test, because now I have a row with all three filled. Okay, now let's do another one. Let's pack details where I've got, again, two different values, but there should have already been a row in the table. So I say there's one row already in the table. So at this point, there should be two rows in which these are both not null. And then, all right, now let's provide pesticide null, spray ID not null, only spray provided, all rows full. So in this case, there should be just one row that has pesticide ID null, spray ID not null. You probably get the idea, right? So this allows me at a high level here to essentially implement or describe my test cases for my very specific test. And if I run this, no, I'm not going to get output, I bet, because reset my schema. So we'll wait in a moment. I think we'll come up with nothing here. Then I'll run it again and we'll see if it worked. And then I'll actually inject a problem and see what that looks like. And it's weird. For some reason on startup, this takes a while, but as you'll see, I'll run it again and it will take almost no time at all. Do we have any comments or questions? No,
not yet.
Wow. That's a quiet show.
If you're watching and you have any comments, share them. Do share.
If you're not watching, you can provide a comment too. It just seems unlikely. Mark Wright, this is the reason developers don't test. The tests often become more complex than the thing they are testing. Well, Mark, that's a really interesting thought. And generally speaking, I would say that most of the programs we want to test are hard to test. Wow, it finally finished. Again, I have no idea why it's doing that, but let's turn DBMS output back on. Let's run it again. There. We got all successes. I'll come back to that in a second. So back to Mark's comment. One of the problems we have with testing our code is that often we test program units that are too big, too complex. So they update 16 tables. They have 5 parameters. They rely on these package variables. So what you'll often want to do is make sure you decompose your programs into smaller units that can be tested individually as building blocks. Now, having said that, Mark, I'm sorry if you feel like this is complex. I mean, I'd like to think that my testing harness is one query. It doesn't feel too complex to me, but obviously I wrote it. All this stuff could seem quite like a lot, but I think if you spend a little time with it, you'll see that it's pretty straightforward. So notice I got all 3 successes. And of course, if you wanted to get fancier, you could put the rows into a table. Anyway, but now let's go back and try it again. And I'm going to change this to yes. So now what I'm saying is after all these tests are run at this point, I should have one row where both of these values are null. I run it again. And now you see I got a failure. Now, one thing that's interesting here one of the reasons I did this is you want to do negative testing as well. In other words, you want to verify that your test harness works both positively and negatively. So if you know that you should be getting a negative result for this scenario, test it and make sure your test harness is showing you properly. If you write a test harness and the first time you run your test, you get all successes, chances are something's wrong somewhere because none of our code is that good.
So what I really like about what you're doing here is it's forcing you to spend some time in thinking about what those test cases should be. And even just, I think that thought process would be helpful in identifying issues with your code and
yeah, I think in a way that's the most important thing, that write that checklist. What do you have to make sure your program does to make sure you're done? The next step is how do you test it, which again is highly useful, not only because you end up doing testing, but by writing your test code, you're also doing another independent validation of your logic. And I say independent validation, that's an important point. One of the problems you can run into by building your own little test harness is you'll copy and paste code from your program into your test. So let's say your program has some complex query in it that drives a cursor for loop. What you don't want to do is copy that query out of the cursor for loop and use it virtually unchanged in your testing. Because if that cursor for loop query has an error in it, you're going to propagate the error into your testing, which again is why it's important to test negatively as well. This should fail. Did it fail? That sort of thing. No more comments. Wow. Usually we have like lots of comments. I'm not quite sure.
People are processing.
That's right.
Do you have any guidelines for when? I mean, would you write a test harness for every piece of code? No, you're going to do this for sort of your more complex.
Here, why don't you unshare me? Turn off my screen share just so we can have big faces for everybody to look at.
Here, I can make them even bigger.
Oh, nice. And by the way, that little horse on this side of me is a cutout horse by my 5-year-old, 6-year-old granddaughter. Wow, that's hard to do backwards. So how do you decide which things to test? Well, I would say that since you have limited amount of testing time, what you want to do is say, what is the most critical thing to test? And then you focus your testing on that. And it's probably the hardest thing to test too, which then takes you back to breaking up your modules into smaller pieces that you can manage and test more easily. really in general, whether it's using UTPL SQL, Questco Tester, et cetera, if you're having a hard time building your tests, that's because your program is probably a little bit too complicated, needs some decomposing. But it's true, you should not try to go to 100% test coverage. That's an ideal that I think larger teams can do. Smaller teams would have trouble finding the resources to do it. So Plummet, isn't it a good way to document your functionalities? Absolutely, totally. Essentially, user requirements should translate into a list of test cases. It's usually not one-to-one because the user requirements are usually a bit higher level, but they should drive your test requirements. And yes, it's another form of documentation. And Anton says, I'm a huge fan of test harnesses. I often create a separate Apex app to run my test harnesses. Yes, absolutely. So clearly you could run this in SQL Developer, but even better is building a UI on top of it. And of course, if you use something like UTPL SQL, you could build your app once, and then everybody can use that app. But in this case, of course, because Apex is so easy to use, it's not hard to throw up a quick app on top of it. Good comments. All right. Well, let's move on. We'll hopefully have more comments rolling in. Why don't you share my screen again? Let's go over to Firefox. So as another part of this, there are two more parts of the program. One is that each week we donate $25 to one of 3 different environmental organizations working to heal the planet. I would say this time, if we don't include in some people, I think I'll leave it you to pick the person who's going to choose, but I'll go over the organizations while you figure that out. So one of them is the Sheldrick Wildlife Trust. They work to stop the extinction and protect large mammals in Africa, primarily elephants, but also rhinos and giraffes, et cetera. One of my favorite organizations in the whole world, especially because elephants are endangered with extinction. And I don't know if you've ever read much about elephants. They are amazing, beautiful, wonderful creatures, loving creatures, families, matriarchs, et cetera. So, Sheldrick Wildlife Foundation. Earthwatch, which is a citizen scientist collaboration to gather information and act on it to save and heal our planet. And Center for Biological Diversity, which focuses primarily on the legal aspect, challenging laws, and they were very busy during the Trump years, to stop negative impacts on our ecosystems. So do we have a winner for this week?
Well, so I would say, Mark, if you are still around, why don't you pop in the comments who you would like this week's donation to go to: Center for Biological Diversity, Sheldrick Wildlife Trust, or Earthwatch.
All right, and while that's going on, then there is my book recommendation of the week. So you can stop sharing my screen. I thought I continued changing things up, so I showed you Out on a Limb, which is about black bears and how they're sentient creatures, a really amazing experience to read. And then the next week it was Assassin's Apprentice, science fiction fantasy book that I know at least one person at Insum followed up with and is enjoying. Save the Elephants. Thank you, Mark. So we'll give $25 to the Sheldrick Wildlife Trust. My book of the week, Horton Hears a Who by Dr. Seuss. So I don't know if hopefully you all know about Dr. Seuss. If English is not your first language, it's tough because it's a very much English-centered book in terms of rhymes and so forth. Dr. Seuss is an amazing author. I know he's been in the news lately, and I'd be happy to talk about that with you. But Horton Hears a Who, absolutely one of my favorite books of all time. Great to read to kids, great to read to yourself. And it's all about having compassion for others. And wow, 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 is this an age, an era in human civilization in which we need compassion for others, not just other humans, but all others, like we've never needed it before. So if you haven't read that book to your kids, read that book to your kids. It will start to build that sense of empathy, that appreciation of others. And the key line in Horton Hears a Who is, a person's a person, no matter how small. And I say, black bears are people, whales are people, bees are people too. So everybody, all right, that's my Feuer tip of the week on the cheap testing. Don't just try things. Take a little bit of time to think through what your program should do, and then think about how you can use SQL and PL SQL to build a pretty straightforward, relatively simple test harness. And I think you will benefit greatly. And also, I need to mention this before, the real value of the test harness is not on you, the developer who wrote the code, but on all the people who will come years later and need to modify your program and are scared as much, scared to death that they're going to make a change and they're not even going to realize they introduced a bug. But if they can just run that script and say, yeah, we're still good, all success, then it's at least as good as it was before. All right.
So I just wanted to remind people that we will be posting your code, your blog on our site later this afternoon. So the link is there. We'll also link to it in the comments. So be sure to check that out if you want to grab Stephen's code.
Yep. Thanks for joining us. And hopefully I'll see you next week. And in the meantime, feel free to get in touch with ideas for testing and otherwise. And also, if you have a tip, a PL SQL tip that you'd like to share with the community, I would love to bring you on as it's not a VIP, very important programmer.
Awesome.
And we'll give you an opportunity to share what you've learned about PL SQL and what you think would be helpful to others. It doesn't have to be rocket science. I don't know any rocket science. It doesn't have to be some amazing feature of PL SQL that nobody's ever heard of. It just has to have been useful to you. And believe me, many others will find it useful too. All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Stay safe. Stay healthy. Stay masked where and when appropriate, which is most of the case. And
get
my
vaccinated.
heart.
Get vaccinated.
Get vaccinated. Yes, please get vaccinated if you can. And to my friends in India and other places around the world that are suffering tremendously from COVID right now, wish you the best. And hopefully all of our other countries can help you. Take care, everybody.
Take care, everyone. Thank you. See you next week. Bye.